the three steps have been, are we recording now? The three steps have been technology produces secularization. Secularization produces secularism. You may want to have that at the top of your notes just to keep in mind where we've been and what's going on here. We're still, by the way, I'll remind you, looking at the subject of worldliness, different ways of approaching the world or different worldviews that people have. And so we started out with the isms, looking at the isms, what that suffix does to a word. And I started with the one which I think serves as the dominant umbrella American worldview. Everything else is related to it, but comes underneath its protection, and that's secularism. So when we said that, we had to backtrack. So I maybe have done it in a little haphazard way, but I intended to do it that way. Backtrack into secularization, which is what produces secularism, and then we'd have to ask ourselves, what produced secularization? We'll backtrack into modern technology. And we got to stop somewhere. I'm sure we could backtrack and say, well, what did that? Well, the Enlightenment and the Renaissance. We've already discussed that before. And what did that? Well, the fall of Constantinople and the coming of the Greek scholars to the West. And, well, what did that? Well, the Turks and the Muslims were fighting. Well, why did they fight? Well, the devil's in it somewhere back in the beginning. But these are the three steps we're concentrating on. Modern technology produces secularization, produces secularism. So, on secularism, this is the final, full-blown, conscious repudiation of all religious influence. Modern technology and secularization are seeds that produce secularism. They are pathways that lead to the expressway of secularism. It's the final, full-blown, conscious repudiation of all religious influence. It is a regular worldview. Secularization is not a worldview. That's an historical process. That's just something that happens. You can't help it. It just happens. You can help secularism. It is a regular worldview or philosophy. That although one may be unconsciously pushed toward by the process of secularization, one can only consciously embrace it. All right, I'll say that again, that it's a regular worldview or philosophy. It's not just a historical process. It's a regular worldview or philosophy that although one may be unconsciously pushed toward, one has to consciously embrace it. Now this is contrasted or set over against secularization, which is an historical process. Now both are dangerous. I'll go back and give you the definition I gave you of secularization. You don't need to write this, but just so that it's right on the forefront of your mind as we're studying this morning. I said that it was a social process, or historical one, preceding secularism, by which the authority and influence of religion are removed from all but the most private spheres, politically, educationally, socially, and economically. The social historical process. And we backed up to ask ourselves the question, what calls that? Modern technology has simply pushed out of the picture the very need for the existence of an extra or supernatural entity. There's no longer a need for that. We have vaccinations, we have modern medicine, we have modern technology, we have modern climate prediction, although it's rather shaky even today. I wouldn't want to bet my life on that, that's for sure. And that's so interesting with all of the technology that we have. I mean, I remember watching television whenever the weatherman would come on with the maps and charts and the fronts, the cold and the warms, and the machines that would test this and test that, and they still can't get it right. I think we're back to one of our points against secularization, that progress isn't necessarily always progress. I still think the best way is to stick your finger up in the wind, lick it, stick it up, and then call people you know east, west, north, south, that live 200 miles from where you are and ask them, how's the weather doing there, and what way is the wind blowing? That's the best way to get a weather forecast. Of course, a storm could start in between the two places, but it'd be more reliable than if there's a prophetic movement today, it's the false prophets of weather forecasting. They're called weather forecasters. They are to forecast the future. They have a prophetic ministry, a prophetic role to predict the future. No one can predict the future. Scripture even says that. And these guys demonstrate it for us. If you were even halfway successful, you could command any salary at any television station anywhere in the world probably, if you were halfway successful in predicting the weather. But we don't need to get into that. We've laughed at those false prophets enough. They're almost worse I think they are in the false prophets in the church, because they're wrong almost all the time about everything. Progress isn't necessarily progress. So in some interesting ways, I think that although secularism is the final product in this all, this is what's a little scary. Secularization may actually be the more dangerous of the two. Now I'm going to go on to explain that. That although secularism is the final product, because of various things, such as, I'll get ahead of myself, it must be consciously embraced. Secularization just affects you, generally without you even knowing that it's affected you, with the use of modern technology. That more and more there are ways by which events can be explained and things done, and unconsciously the need for God and dependence upon Him is pushed right out of the picture, or pushed to the perimeter if nothing else. Secularism is something you've got to consciously embrace. You know what you're doing when you say, I deny the reality of eternity, of a future life, of the existence of an extra or supernatural entity or being. Secularization can sneak in on you because of modern technology and affect you. And I think it has affected the church to a large degree. Without the church accepting the philosophy of secularism, the church would never do that. You're just denying everything that Christianity stands for. To embrace secularism, which denies the existence of eternity. But through secularization, the church has been sorely affected. So last week we were looking at what can we do, or what's the Christian's attitude, and I think I ended with the 8th point or so, that as Christians we must find ways to demonstrate our dependence upon an extra-natural entity and deity, God. We must find ways to demonstrate our dependence on Him. Because you don't need Him, quote unquote, in the way ancient man did, with all of the modern conveniences that are around. So we have to find ways. Do away with modern conveniences, find other ways we can trust in Him. And the Scriptures have given us one good way. The Scriptures don't say that you've got to trust God to take care of your animal, your horse, because that's your means of locomotion. You can drive a car, but right away now you're not dependent on God who sends the sun and the rain, that grows the food, that feeds the horse, that keeps the horse alive. Now you're dependent on your own ingenuity to keep a mechanical automobile operating. You're not dependent on God. You're dependent on your own skills and abilities there. So you see, you lose an area of dependence on the deity. And that's what modern technology has done. It's taken away more and more and more areas. Secularization pushes God further and further and further out of our life. And eventually it leads to secularism for some people. It doesn't have to. But secularization is bad enough. And I think the Scriptures give us one good area to show our dependence, and that is in the area of divine healing, where the Scriptures forbid the use of medical science for the healing of the Christian, regardless of how good medical science has become. And again, in that area, to quote G.K. Chesterton, progress isn't all that it is meant to be. Progress isn't necessarily progress. I'm going to read a little bit, if you'll give me a few moments before I get into what I wanted to say. I saw another interesting section in Os Guinness's The Gravedigger File on this business of the relationship between secularism and secularization, explaining, and I think that I would agree with what he has to say, that in the end, secularization, although it's really a stepping stone to secularism, may be the more dangerous of the two. Listen to what he has to say. The technical term for this matter that he's been discussing is secularization. This has been defined in a host of conflicting ways, many of which can be traced back to the superb confusion sown by the Department of Disinformation. This is written on the order of a C.S. Lewis Screwtape Letters, as I've said before. But we must never succumb to our own propaganda, so it is important to keep the proper definition clearly in mind. Now he gives his definition, and it's similar to mine. By secularization, I mean the process through which, starting from the center and moving outward, successive sectors of society and culture have been freed from the decisive influence of religious ideas and institutions. In other words, secularization is a process by which we have neutralized the social and cultural significance of religion in the central areas of modern society, such as the worlds of science, technology, bureaucracy, and so on, making religious ideas less meaningful and religious institutions more marginal. Our goals in this are simple: to negate worship and to neutralize the adversary's role. Adversary being God in this case. I realize that this definition begs a number of key questions, but let me leave them on one side for the moment and turn to a most extraordinary fact. Since 1900, the percentage of the world's atheistic and non-religious peoples, including agnostics, materialists, communists, and so on, has grown from 0.2% to 21.3%. In other words, from a mere 1/5 of 1% of the world's population to over 1/5, just since 1900. This is the most dramatic change on the entire religious map of the 20th century. Even Christian findings affirm this now, although the gloomiest of Christian prophets didn't foresee such a possibility in 1900. Atheistic and non-religious peoples now form the second largest bloc in the world, second only to Christians, and are catching up with them fast. 8.5 million converts, quote unquote, each year to be precise. If they continue to multiply at the same rate, they'll reach 1 billion by the much dreaded year 1984. This was obviously written, this book, before 1984. How's that for a statistic to embellish some new conspiracy theory? Come now, you may be saying, you can't take credit for that. That success is due to the improved performance of the counter-apologetics division. In other words, intellectual arguments against the Christian faith. In one way, you would be quite correct, but that distorts the true picture of what has happened. As I had defined it, secularization is not the same thing as secularism. So it cannot be measured by a Dow Jones index of rising or falling atheism. Secularism is a philosophy and has all the strengths and weaknesses of one, not least that to subscribe to it usually demands some effort of the mind or will. All right, he's saying that's one of the weaknesses of secularism as a philosophy. If it's a viewpoint, you don't just stumble into it, you adopt it, and you know what's going on. Secularization, by contrast, is not a philosophy. It's a process. More important still, its roots are not in an intellectual concept, but in institutional change. It's a process which has actually taken place in the structures of society. Unlike a philosophy, this mentality is not something people think about or choose, rather it rubs off on them. It comes as part and parcel of objective, institutional changes which have actually occurred through modernization and cannot be avoided or simply wished away. Secularization is therefore contagious in a way that secularism never is. Wherever modernization goes, some degree of infection is inevitable. Now, I think Guinness is exactly right, and I had the same things to say, that when you get right down to it, secularization is more dangerous. It's not asking you to accept consciously an unchristian or anti-religious framework of thinking, but it's affecting you in every area of your life. Religion is being de-emphasized. Religion is being ridiculed and mocked. Modern technology, the glories and beauties of the intelligentsia and science are being extolled. And unconsciously you fall into it and you start becoming critical or suspicious when it comes to religious notions or religious things. Well, now, how can we know whether this is right or wrong? Because you're in the know generation. It has to be empirically verified or proven. And since those standards of empirical verifiability don't work with unseen extranatural events and causes and beliefs and entities, then you're up a creek without a paddle, to be sure. How are you going to? It takes faith. You can't prove that these things exist. And yet, anywhere out in the business world, does anyone ever tell you, well, according to the statistics, it won't work, but just take it by faith and wing it? No, that'll never work. You always do all your research and make sure this is going to do, and that's going to do, and that's going to do. You can't do that for the faith. You can't do that for religious notions. So you're dealing, in other words, with two different worlds and two different sets of standards living in those worlds. You wouldn't survive in this world with everything that you do in the natural just saying, well, I'm going to take it by faith. You've got to do some thinking and some researching and some planning. You have to get by. So it's a very difficult situation the Christian finds himself in. And so the non-Christian finds an easy way out. He just denies the other world. And he denies those stirrings in his own breast that tells him, I am a sinner, there is an eternity, there is a heaven and hell, there is a God who's going to hold me responsible for my sins. He denies that. He suppresses those. Paul speaks of that in Romans chapter 1. The man that suppresses the thoughts that he has, and he turns God into an idol then. An idol in a foreign civilization, or the intellect in a modern civilized people like the United States of America. So what I want to do this morning is move on and address the issue of secularism specifically, since we've looked at all of these other things previously. Remember that the word comes from the Latin term for world. There were two Latin words, I'll just remind you of this, seculum, which is translated world, and mundus, M-U-N-D-U-S, which is translated world. The first, however, is a time concept. The second is a space one, generally speaking. And they have their Greek equivalents, eon and cosmos. And we really don't have that in English. We've got to use the word time or space in order to have it. They have it with the same word that means world. Now that's going to be important this morning. If you don't remember all of what I just said, just remember this, that our word secular comes from the Latin word seculum, S-A-E-C-U-L-U-M, which means world, or more specifically, this age, this time. It's a time word, not a space word like globe. Globe is not a time word, it's a space word. But it also means world. World could be globe, but world could be something else, a time word as well. Now, do you remember when we looked at secularization to begin with, I told you that originally the word secularization could trace itself way back to the mid-17th century, and it referred to the transfer of church property from ecclesiastical to non-ecclesiastical rule. Okay, we're going to find something similar with the word secular. Originally, the word secular was used during the Middle Ages to speak of the divisions of religious orders and ministries. In other words, it was not used then as it is today. If you come across the term secular back in the Middle Ages, you can't read your own 20th century definition or feeling for that word into the Middle Ages. They meant something else entirely. It was used to speak of the divisions of religious orders and ministries, so that those under ecclesiastical, or more specifically monastic, that is by the monasteries, rule, were called sacred, and those not were called secular. But both were still religious, though. See, today secular means anti-religious. Secular then meant religious, but not under ecclesiastical or monastic rule. Let me say that again. The term sacred was used for those religious orders, offices, or ministries under ecclesiastical or monastic rule. and those not were called secular. Okay, now let me give you an example if you don't understand what I mean. Let's take a monk during the Middle Ages who was a teaching official in the monastery. Then that capacity he fulfilled would come under the term sacred, because it's under the control of the monastery, and it's under the influence of the monastery. It has something to do with the monastery itself. On the other hand, we could take another monk who's part of the same monastery, but whose work is helping orphans out on the streets. His work would be called secular. They're both religious. They're both done by religious people. One is within the confines of the monastery or the church. One is without it. Now, we have the same, in religious circles, we have the same type distinction that has been carried down until this day. But we generally don't call it sacred, we call it religious, and we sometimes call it Christian. We sometimes hear it called full-time Christian service, which may mean nothing more than a pastor's secretary who does nothing but type letters. But she is in full-time Christian work. I've always thought this was a little ridiculous. You might have a man who cobbles shoes for a living, but who preaches the gospel when he can, and he's much more effective in the kingdom of God, and yet what is he called? Well, he's involved in secular work. Well, the Bible never notices these distinctions. The Bible never speaks of distinctions like this, sacred and secular. The Middle Ages did, and I'm sad to say that the modern church repeats the same mistake. That, a janitor, if he's in a church building, if he's the church janitor, he's in full-time Christian service because he's connected to the church. But if you're anything outside the church, you're in secular employment. But anyway, to get back to the Middle Age usage, regardless of sacred or secular designation, they're both still religious. In other words, secular was not used then as it is today, meaning something non- or anti-religious. It's just that one form of ministry had more to do with the church and another with the world, or the seculum. Therefore, it was called secular work on the basis of the Latin term. You may be surprised to learn that another term was also used to speak of this non-monastic, non-ecclesiastical realm. That is another word besides secular, and that was the word. I hope I don't lose you with these words, but I got to give you the background here. We're talking about secular first, and that was the word profane. Now, we mean things entirely different than they did by the use of these two words today. This was a perfectly good religious term, profane. All profane meant was it was an activity outside of monastic or ecclesiastical rule and influence. I'll give you probably the most famous example in church history. Martin Luther was always calling for a secular, profane priesthood. Well, you see, if you're reading Martin Luther with our understanding of the words, you'd say, I can't believe this guy, asking for that priests be secular and profane. Well, all he meant is get out of the dead church and get out into the world and do something with your life. That's what he meant. Get out of the confines, the cloisters of the monasteries, and get out and do something with your gift that you have and live your Christianity. So Martin Luther, you find these words, especially the word profane, in his writings a lot. And he always called for a secular, profane priesthood. So it fit perfectly for the Reformation years. Those terms would not fit very well for today, to call for a secular, profane church. We're opposed to those churches that are secular and profane. But it's because the meaning of the words have now changed. So, church rule, we would set it up like this. Church rule, everything there is sacred. Non-church rule, the things out there would be secular. Still, it's religious, though. All of this is still religion, though. It could be called secular, one of the Latin words. It could also be called mundane. You see, we use that word a little differently today. Mundus was the space word in Latin for world, or it could be called profane. You got three different choices there. So the reason I'm putting this up here and spending the time is because we use all three of these words so radically differently today. Mundane, secular, and profane are just terrible words in Christian vocabulary. And they weren't necessarily that then. And the biggest thing I'm trying to emphasize this morning is that all three of these were very God-centered and religious. Very God-centered and religious. Done by religious people in the name of God. This word, profane, is another Latin term. All these happen to be Latin terms that literally means, if we took it into English, literally means this: outside the temple. So it's a perfectly good word. We talk about the outreach of our church, we're talking about a profane ministry. You have a profane ministry. I have one that's in the temple, right? You have a profane one. Now you can talk about the profane things you've done during that day. But really, literally, that's true if we know what the Latin words mean. That's all we're saying. Go back to the original meaning. Now the meaning of the word has changed, so we get into trouble today. But we can use it among ourselves. Yeah, I was really secular and profane today. That means you were carrying on your Christian ministry outside the church, outside the temple. You had an outreach out there. So you can see why Luther was using this term then. He was begging for people to get out of the deadness of the church. Nothing's being accomplished there. Get outside the temple. Go into the world and be a light and convert people and witness and share and minister out there. He begged for a secular, profane, mundane priesthood, one that was concerned about this world and helping people in this world. Well, today, of course, especially the first and the third, secular and profane, these two terms are antonyms for religion today. I mean, they are antonyms for that. Mundane is not necessarily. Mundane is maybe an antonym for anything that's worthwhile or spiritual. Well, this is mundane versus something that is not mundane, that is eternal. So I think the three words, in my mind, somehow they all come together. And they all are Latin terms, not Greek terms. Secular, mundane, profane. And they all mean essentially the same thing. All right, so when, we might ask after this, did the terms secular and secularism take that negative sense we think of today, that non or more so anti-religious sense that they have today? It's totally foreign to the origin of the term, secular, secularism, totally foreign to how it was used in the Middle Ages up through the Reformation era. Well, I'll give you a little of the historical background to that. Times change, and meanings and connotations of words change. In the 19th century, there was one G.H. Holyoake. Of all things, he had a good name, Holy. Holyoake. G.H. Holyoake, who lived from 1817 to 1906, is credited, if this is a credit, as being the first man to use the term secular or secularism in its 1980s understanding. That is, in the modern usage of the term. A negative, anti-religious usage. That's totally foreign to the Middle Ages and the Reformation era. He used it in a speech in 1851. So it was an old term, but in a sense you could say he coined a new meaning for it. It was used in a speech by G.H. Holyoake in 1851, where he took the word secularism, coined a new meaning, which is its present day non, or more specifically, anti-religious belief. For Holyoake, and ever since then, when that word is used, unless it depends on the context. Again, to go back to what I said earlier, sometimes people in the church talk about full-time Christian service versus secular work, and they don't mean that you're doing anti-religious work out there. But when it's used with the ISM, the secularism, then we are talking about a worldview and a philosophy, which is a denial, according to Holyoake, of all supernatural causality, I'm giving you just a brief definition of secularism from Holyoke's usage, and we're all indebted, if we use that term in that way, to him and his understanding of it, what he meant by it. A denial of all supernatural causality. God doesn't make the sun to come or the rains to fall or plants to grow. He's not behind anything because he doesn't exist. And an affirmation of a non-religious approach to personal existence. A denial of all supernatural causality and an affirmation of a non-religious approach to personal existence. So it's saying no and yes. It's saying no to God and yes to humanism, yes to man. It's a no and yes view. No to God, yes to man. A denial, that means no. A denial of supernatural causality, and affirmation, that means yes, of a non-religious approach to man's existence. So you contrast this now with secularization. Secularization is just that historical process that unconsciously forces religion to the perimeters of human life and society.
For the continuation of the
So you contrast this now with secularization. Secularization is just that historical process that unconsciously forces religion to the perimeters of human life and society. But secularism is a thought-out ideology that takes the forms of non-religious and anti-religious bias. Secularism is a thought-out ideology which takes the forms of a non-religious and anti-religious bias. You find both of those manifestations among secularists. Some are just non-religious. The angry atheists are anti-religious. They're secularists, but if they're angry, they're fighting against something that's anti-religion. Some people out there in the world, I'm sure you've met many of them, are secularists. They deny the very things we're saying and affirm the others, but they're non-religious. They don't think about religion. They don't try to fight against religion. It's no concern of theirs. They think and live as though there is no God. But there are others who like to argue against the existence of God. You're talking about an anti-religious bias there. Those are the rabid folk like Madeline Murray O'Hare. Holyoke founded one of the first secular societies, and that was its name, the Secular Society, in England. By the way, there were over 100 of them founded in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s. He founded one of the first secular societies. Here are some of the things he said. Now, you don't need to write this because I'm going to give you my own list of exactly what comprised secularism for Holyoke. But here from his own writings, he had these things to say. We believe in relative truth and in discretionary silence, in reason as a test, in science as a power, in service as a duty, and in endurance as a virtue. That's like the Apostles' Creed for them. We believe in relative truth, notice relativism there, and discretionary silence. Some things you don't know about, so don't talk about. The religious man acts like he knows everything. He can predict the future. He reads the Bible and predicts the past. He can tell you about the origin of the world, how the world's going to end up. We can't. God has revealed it to us in His Word. They think that's presumptuous for man to think that he can do all that. Well, they're the ones presumptuous to deny the fact that God has revealed that to man. We couldn't otherwise. We can know the origins and the meanwhiles and the ends. We can know from eternity before and eternity after because it's revealed. He said, we believe in relative truth and in discretionary silence, in reason as a test, in science as a power, in service as a duty, and in endurance as a virtue. He goes on, this is even better, I think. I wish to free the secular sphere to authorize all men to walk in it without alarm of any kind, like that created by many parts of the New Testament. You know, like flee from the wrath to come and warning us of hell and perdition. He said, I want a free man to walk without alarm of any kind, like that created by many parts of the New Testament. You better believe it'll create alarm in your heart whenever you read it. It'll warn you of your sin and of eternal destruction and damnation. Well, they don't like that. That bothers their conscience, you know. So he wants to free man from that. Now listen to this. You got to catch this carefully. We should not pray for the people after the church in dissenting matter. We should seek to help them. In other words, he thought that was just a cop-out, praying to some unknown, doesn't exist deity, and use that as an excuse for not helping. Well, James touches on that surely we should help people. We can't just say, well, go on your way and be warmed and filled, notwithstanding we give them not those things that are needful to the body. But holyoke, of course, means it in its absolute, ultimate, complete sense. We should not send dogma missionaries to the heathen. We should send arts, sciences, and instructors. Leave religious dreamers to wait on supernatural aid. Let us look to what man can do for man. Thus it is in vain that the miner descends into the earth with a prayer on his lips, unless he carries a Davy lamp in his hand. During the prevalence of pestilence, you know, like a plague or something, an hospital is of much more value than a college of theologians. Well, maybe with contemporary theology where it is, he's right. A hospital would be better. But he means a church. No, in a time of pestilence, the church is of far more value than a hospital because God can heal and cure the sick. The hospital can't. So he's striking at everything, anything religious, supernatural. He thinks, and this is the old view of Marx and all of those people during that century, that Christianity, any form of religion, but especially Christianity, is weak, it's pathetic, it's anemic, and it's a cop-out from man dealing with responsibilities that he has in life. And they've simply failed to understand. What they've done is they've looked at institutional Christianity, and some of their criticisms are right. It is weak and sickly and anemic, and it is a cop-out, but not biblical Christianity, though. So let me give you my own list of, here's what secularism was comprised of for G.H. Holyoke, under about 5 or 6 points here. Number one, science. Science was man's guide. Science was man's guide and savior. So one of the first things I said about modern technology is we must not look to it as our savior or our salvation. That's the view of the secularists. Science has all answers because science is all wise and all creative. And that is just that's a lie if I've ever heard a lie. Science, they can't even unravel the simple things of life. Like what I was observing while I was studying for the message this morning, a robin pulling a worm out of the ground. And I've seen those robins do that right when there's bulldozers and everything all around. So I don't know if it's, how can you say they're hearing it or they're feeling vibrations? You're feeling vibrations and hearing noise with bulldozers around. They still can get it. Do they have X-ray vision? Maybe they do. I don't know how to explain it. That'd be almost the best guess if you can put a bulldozer and a backhoe beside and they're churning the ground up and snorting and hissing, and he yanks that worm out anyway. Depending on sound or movement or, I don't know, maybe he's got Superman X-ray vision and can see through. But no one's explained that, and any of us who've ever done any fishing, you know, it's a trial to go out and try to find the worms. You go out with shovel and bucket and dig and hack, and you just need to train a robin and put him on a string and let him go find them. This one that I watched this morning, I mean, he went down and got that thing and yank, stretching. And I always break a worm when I'm trying to pull it. How does he get it out of the ground? I mean, I got to dig all around it and break the dirt off around. He can slip that thing right out of the hole. They can't even unravel the simple mysteries. It's a mystery. The simple mysteries of life. And what's so interesting about science is oftentimes they overlook the simple. Amen. And they're dealing with what's going on Mars or Neptune. It's not going to do us humans any good at all. I'd rather have things about our Robin explained to me or something that I can benefit from, not what's going on in outer space. So science is man's guide and his salvation or Savior. Holyoke taught, secondly, that morals are to be independent from Christianity. Well, in other words, you have no guide for morals. It's almost situation ethics before situation ethics. Morals are to be independent from Christianity, independent from biblical statutes of do this and don't do that. That would be bondage and legalism, of course. We all know that's what the situation ethicists tell us. That's bondage and legalism. God's a God of love. Thirdly, reason is the measure of truth. Reason is the measure of truth. So if a Christian presents you, let's say, with the doctrine of the Trinity or divine sovereignty or the second advent, the way you'll know whether that's truth or not is by your mind. Does it make any sense to you? If it doesn't make any sense, if it cannot compute by reason, then it is not true. But that breaks down in simple areas in even this life, where sometimes things that don't stand to reason are true nevertheless. You could take the simple thing of the sun rising and setting. I mean, first glance and reason tells us the sun rises and sets. That's what reason would say. Now, I know you can go on and reason would prove otherwise, but first glance, even the non-religious people held to that for years and years, centuries and centuries, because that's what reason says. That's what, in other words, sense evidence tells us. But oftentimes sense evidence is deceptive. Or another example, you ever been out west on those railroad tracks that go for miles and miles? If you get on them and stand and look, you know what happens? Way down the road, what happens? They converge, don't they? They go together. But then when you walk down there, they're still apart. You know, you'd have to have a train going and just watch the thing smash like a sandwich, as the rails got too narrow for it. That never happens. But your sense evidence tells you that. It's an optical illusion. Stand on a railroad track, you got to be in a flat enough place with a long enough distance and look, and those tracks will converge. But we know that they don't. But reason or sight, sense evidence would tell us that they do. The same is true with a lot of other so-called optical illusions. Reason is the measure of truth. Then fourthly, Holyoke said that man's goal should be the elimination of social inequalities in this life, rather than a discussion of possible compensation in the next. Those of you that heard Burlington Socialist Mayor Bernard Sanders would know he's of this opinion. He threw in a little bit of religion in his debate with Calvin Thomas, but then he did end by saying, I'm not a particularly religious man. I would have taken the particularly out. You're not a religious man at all. I don't know what you mean by particularly religious. Not only you're not religious, you're anti-religious, as his debate made clear. All he was after is, we got to help the poor, we got to help the poor. He thinks that's man's calling. That's good old liberalism and secularism. I'll say it again. Man's goal should be the elimination. Now, I wrote these notes before I heard Sanders. You can almost always trust that that's true of me. I don't go copying something that I heard yesterday morning or last night. Man's goal should be the elimination of social inequalities in this life. That's his goal. That's what he should spend his whole life for. Social gospel movement in the church bought into this theory, because there's just enough truth to it that we should try to help out our neighbor. There's just enough truth to it for the devil to deceive people. He puts it out and they swallow hook, line, and sinker. Because he can quote a few verses that Amos the prophet told the people they should be concerned about social inequality in their midst. And that's exactly what Amos said. But Amos said more than that, though. And Amos was a prophet from God, and God spoke to him. Well, see, the secularists don't believe in all of that. So you're being dishonest to use only that which fits your theory out of the Bible. Man's goal should be the elimination of social inequalities in this life, rather than... And it's not a rather than, both have to be combined for the Christian, rather than a discussion of possible compensation in the next. He said, that's what you Christian, that's what you spend all your time doing. You don't go out, you don't put some feet to your Christianity and go out and help people. You just tell them about the sweet by and by. Well, maybe for the institutional church, a lot of that is true in some regards, but it doesn't have to be, and that's not necessarily this in its complete sense, the Christian way. The Bible does, though, tell us, don't fret ourselves because of evildoers. We've got a greater future reward in the heavenly realm, in the next life. So there is future compensation. We need to remember that. But the Bible is not at odds with social inequality, on the other hand, though. And this is all Sanders could seem to think of. Social inequality, poor this, poor that, poor the other. And he just refused to think of anything eternal or anything absolute or anything transcendent. The only thing absolute was we've got to absolutely help the poor people. But the Word of God says you'll always have the poor with you. It's a deluded notion to think that anybody in any country, in any situation, can ever completely relieve itself of the poor. And those who thought they could, the socialists, they've proven that their own theory doesn't work. You've got the same problems in the Soviet Union and communist bloc countries that you have in the United States. Fifthly, the state should be neutral in religious matters. Well, he's probably closer to truth there than a lot of religious people are today, wanting to have prayer breakfasts with congressmen and senators and all of this. The state should be neutral. There's only one theocracy in history, and that was Israel of the Old Testament. Every other nation, every other government is under the control of the devil. And appropriately enough should be. So, we could state this differently, this fifth point. Maybe government should be anti-religious. I don't know. I'd hate to say that. I don't want to wish evil on myself, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happened to be anti-religious, instead of being neutral in religious matters, being anti-Christian. That would be perfectly fine. That wouldn't be anything unusual according to scriptural teaching. And really, neutrality is a myth. You can't just be neutral. You're going to espouse one view or another. And then finally, tolerance should be equally extended to all beliefs. That's good secularism and liberalism there. Tolerance should be equally extended to all beliefs. Now, what he's doing there, he's thinking back on, well, for him, the not that distant past, where there was so much fighting, murder, persecution, all under the banner of the cross of Christ and in the name of God Almighty. And that is a blot on the history of Christendom, but that's religious man and not New Testament biblical Christianity, where Christians kill Christians, or Christians kill the atheists, or the atheists do that. You find that all through church history. And so, see, people like Holyoke, their disadvantage is they've never seen a New Testament group of people. They've never heard pure New Testament teaching. All he knows is institutional religion. And if that's the case, then he's almost justified in some of his criticisms here. So there's the historical background to the modern definition and use of the term secularism. It only goes back, as you see, a little over 100 years ago, about 130 years ago. So let me go on and say some more things now about secularism this morning before we conclude. The only way we're going to, for ourselves, really get at the meaning of secularism is to look at how it's used in the Latin, and that is, it is a time word. So what we're talking about when we talk about secularism as a philosophy, or a secularist as one who espouses that, is a person who is totally of this age. If you can remember the phrase that secularism is a of this age belief, then you'll have it all. Of this age. It restricts his vision to this life and his existence now, because it implicitly denies eternity. There's nothing beyond the here and the now. Mundus seculum would be the here, a place word, and the now, a time word. There's nothing beyond the here and the now, the mundus seculum. What this means in Christian theology is there's no heaven or hell. There is no life after death. There is no eternity. There is no future reward or punishment. There is no extra-natural realm or entity. The true meaning of life can only be found in the present age. They would tell us that we need have no fear of or recourse to any myth such as the eternity of personal existence. You know, to justify why you are or aren't doing something now in life, we Christians have recourse to what they would call a myth of the eternity of personal existence. That there's going to be a day of reckoning, a day of judgment, a day of punishment, a day of reward. That should steer us on the course of life while we're on this planet now. But they say that's a myth. So they would say we have need of no fear of or recourse to any such myth as the eternity of personal existence. In other words, for them, death for everyone is not a comma, but it is a period. That death brings the end of man. All they can see in man is the bodily man, that is the flesh. And they completely deny or ignore the spiritual side of man, that there is something to him that can survive the decease and the corruption of the flesh. There's something about him that can survive that. Man could be at ground zero for an atomic weapon, and he will survive. Now, his body may be blown to smithereens or vaporized, but he will never die. He will continue to live. Now, see, that's beyond the wildest dream or imagination of a secularist. That you could be at ground zero for the detonation of a nuclear weapon, and man will survive. God has made man, he's more powerful than an atomic weapon. He will conquer that weapon. That weapon will detonate and the radioactivity will be gone within several decades of time. Man will never be gone. He will live forever and ever. Well, they deny that. And you see, there is a practical reason behind this denial. It allows man to live as he wants to live. Let's not forget that. There is a practical reason behind their theology. It allows man to live as he wants to live. Now, that'd be pretty good, wouldn't it? We could do anything we want to do in this life with no fear of any future eternal punishment. I think I'd pick the easiest and the funnest way to live then. If whenever I die, I'm dead. That's Paul's whole argument in 1 Corinthians 15:32b. What advantage is it to me if the dead do not rise? Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. That's his argument. What advantage is it to do anything in life? I think that verse talks about him. He said, if I have after the manner of men fought with wild beasts at Ephesus, what advantageth it me if the dead rise not? Why go through the struggle? Why go through the difficulties? What advantageth it me if the dead rise not? If there's not going to be a resurrection of the just and the unjust, what does it profit me? Nothing. His conclusion is, if the dead do not rise, that is, if there is no eternity of personal existence, then let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. For the secularists, he would say, there has been a past. He will admit there will be a future. But there will be only a future insofar as it concerns this space-time existence. In other words, there'll be a tomorrow. And there will be a tomorrow after that. There will be a future, but only as far as it concerns this space-time existence. Or to say it another way, he would admit there has been a past, there will be a future, but away with the myth of eternity. Well, I think it's kind of appropriate to have studied this after looking at J.B. Phillips and some of his radical denials and departures from Orthodox truth, because, of course, I trust you can see what this does is weaken and finally it destroys the Christian gospel and message. There's no eternity, no heaven, just dealing with the first thing, secularism of this age, which implicitly denies the existence of anything outside this age. Well, what you've done is destroy all of Christianity then. Just by this one term as it's used today, secularism, a this age-ness, you've denied the reality of everything outside that, denied the need for it. You have thus weakened and destroyed the whole message of the Christian gospel, which is all about a future day. I mean, the scriptures are full of references to a future day of reckoning, a day of punishment, of eternal punishment, not temporary, of eternal punishment, and of reward, not temporary reward, of eternal reward for people who have been dead and have been resurrected. Let me give you my concluding statements on secularism. Next week we're going to start into a slightly different area. I'm not even going to say what it is till we get there. You'll probably be surprised. And then whenever we finish that, then we'll come to the complete end of our study of our first worldview, which is secularism. And I'll have more things to say about secularism. But I just have some interesting personal points here to conclude with. Number one, to me, I find it rather fascinating, ironic, to see such a revival in the West in all forms of the occult and spiritualism among people who philosophically deny anything beyond the empirically verifiable. I find that to be a very humorous, ironic point, a laughing matter. In other words, we're back to the issue of inconsistency in people and their lives. Now, I just get these thoughts, that's how I get them, they're thoughts. I sit and think about it. Well, now, take a secularist, and does he live it all the way out? What's he going into palm reading for and reading the stars and dabbling in the occult and sorcery and witchcraft? You know, there aren't any demons, or there's not anything extra or supernatural. Only what you can do with levers and screwdrivers and hammers is all you can do. So I find it rather ironic to see in the modern West, and you haven't been reading, if you don't know this, such a revival in all forms of the occult and spiritualism among people, oftentimes the educated, who philosophically deny anything beyond the empirically verifiable. I think that simply serves to show that man is incurably religious. You can get him indoctrinated philosophically with a certain view which denies religion, but he is, in his basic makeup, he is incurably religious. He is looking for something beyond what he can see and touch and analyze, which he's going to call then, when he finds it, reality. That's why people are into TM, transcendental meditation. That's reality. They're looking for, quote, reality. And they're looking for it in areas that they deny where they can find it. There's nothing beyond what you can see and touch, and yet they're dabbling in it all the time anyway. His very nature, man's very nature, causes him to search for reality beyond the space-time existence that he knows. Man's very nature causes him to search for reality beyond the space-time existence that he knows. I would say, secondly, you have to watch out for this concerning secularism, that advertising makes a big play on the theme of secularism. Advertising makes a big play on this. The beers say this: you only go around once in life, so grab for all the gusto. That's almost the modern creed of secularism now. You only go around once in life, and of course there's nothing after life, so grab for all the gusto now. Pepsi calls this what? The now generation. The now generation. They are consciously toying with this philosophical notion of secularism here because they know that it appeals to the modern man in the modern West. So recent advertising makes a big play on this. I would say, in the third place, secularism often seems to be a reaction to the extreme discontinuity expressed by typical Christendom. Secularism also seems to be a reaction to the extreme discontinuity expressed by typical Christendom. That is, so many church members, at least in their religious settings, spend all their time talking about going to heaven one day, going to heaven, with never a reference to their existence now, that is, the connection between the two. They just talk about going to heaven, but live down here however they want to live. But they're always talking about going to heaven. It's an extreme form of discontinuity. And so the secularists come along and try to balance that by doing nothing but talking about this life, where the Bible really puts the two together and would say it like this: what we do right now counts forever. All right, see, we've drawn together the this life and the next life. Unlike the church members who only want to talk about the next life, going to heaven to see Jesus, and the secularist who only wants to talk about this life, enjoying the now generation. The Bible would say this: there's an element of truth in both of them. What we do right now counts forever. Forever is important. There is an eternity. But it's not isolated without any reference to our existence in the here and the now. What we do in the here and the now counts forever. So life is tied to eternity. Someone said this one time I came across. They said life is an investment. We're always talking about investments with money. Life is an investment. It's the greatest one you'll ever make. Money's not important how you invest it. In the final analysis, it's important how you invest your life. What are you investing it in? Things spiritual, things eternal, things worthwhile, or of this ageness. Life is an investment. It's the greatest one you'll ever make. So I don't think that the secularists would exactly be in favor of C.S. Lewis's famous statement, "What is not eternal is eternally out of date." Suffice it to say that our time and existence is but one small bubble in the ocean of eternity.